تمام. مساء الخير جميعا. أهلا وسهلا بكم جميعا بالحضور الكريم في هذه الفعالية النقاشية التي تأتي ضمن سلسلة من الفعاليات تحت عنوان الأسواق والصراعات، استكشاف اقتصاديات الحرب في الإقليم العربي. سأستبدل هذا المصطلح بدل الشرق الأوسط لأسباب مختلفة. طبعا تأتي هذه الفعالية تحت رعاية كلية العلوم الاجتماعية والإنسانية بالتعاون مع مركز دراسات النزاع والعمل الإنساني، هو أيضا نشاط مشترك بالتنسيق بين برنامج العلوم السياسية وبرنامج دراسات النزاع والعمل الإنساني. أيضا شكر خاص للزميلات الباحثات المشاركات في هذه الجلسة النقاشية، والتي تسعى إلى تسليط الضوء على ما يتوفر من جهود بحثية عن اقتصاد الحرب بالتركيز على الحالة العربية. أقوم هنا
situation. Now I'm going to introduce them. First of all, Dr. Catherine Charrett. She is a lecturer in international politics at the University of Westminster, and she teaches resistance, anti-colonial resistance, and the focus is on the Palestinian politics. She has a series of books and peer-reviewed articles, and she focused also on the cooperation between the EU and Palestine. Dr. Rahaf Aldoughli, she is the Director of Studies at now she teaches at Lancaster University, and she was a visiting fellow at the Middle East Center at the London College, WIIS, and she had research about peace and justice in the Syrian context. And Dr. Mary Norbakk, she is from CMI, and in Norway. She also coordinates a research group about rights and gender, and she focuses on social anthropology and political economy, and also the conflict and military field. We will have a discussion more than a presentation. Actually, I will be asking a series of questions to the colleagues, and then at a later stage there will be an open discussion with the participants here with us in the room. But before kickstarting this discussion, I would like to present the concept of economy of war and how it evolved in modern history. So when we talk about the relation between conflict and economy, we are talking about intertwining relation. Economy has historically been at the heart of conflicts because wars cannot be waged without economic resources supporting militaries and military arsenals. At the same time, there are no wars attempting to achieve strategic objectives, mainly economic interests, and also we should not forget the destructive repercussions of the war on infrastructure and societies and states. Today we are going to talk from an academic and research perspective and describing the relation during the World War II and the militarization of the economy in the United States and the militarization of the society, and then it was called the arsenal of democracy. And the program actually focused on the intervention of the state in restructuring the economy and mobilizing at the military level and producing military arsenal and investing in scientific and technological research. At a later stage, after World War II, this concept developed, and we have the economy of war, the permanent economy of war, after the adoption by the US of military Keynes concept, and President Eisenhower actually created the new alliance that is informal, formed by a wide network linking between bureaucrats, politicians, military, private companies, interests, seeking to sustain this pattern of militarized economy in order to have lucrative results and profit. And back then, it was said, more guns, more butter in the United States. So this was to express the interests and the economic gains. Cold War actually played a key role when it comes to the armament race between the West and the East Bloc, and there's also the Korea War and the intervention in Vietnam and end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the Second Gulf War. In the 90s, there was a war within states, like civil war, also wars of separation, and rebellious movement, and this reflected the shift at the international level, the expansion of economic globalization, and this went hand in hand with a new wave of studies saying that apparently we would have chaos of war, but implicitly we have an alternative economic system that was organized and that exchange or replaces the economy of peace. The context of war has specificities that are linked with key shifts at the level of the society and new social classes benefiting directly from the new lucrative sources created by the war and the concentration of wealth and the use of political and military interests at the service of local and international parties. Of course, we are talking about a series of things that are could include, for instance, the transnational organized crime group dealing drugs and weapons, mercenaries, warlords, proxies, and also the governance of armed militias and rebel group, also self-financing of fighters, and the criticism addressed to humanitarian organizations when it comes to their involvement in this economy. Last but not least, it is important to mention that the economy of war has widespread repercussions on the post-war era. The reconstruction, particularly when it comes to the liberal structure of peace that deals with peace as being a middle ground between the fighting elites and not multi-layered social operation. This is why the actors in the economy of war become actors in the post-war economy, and this helps us understand the corruption and the volatility of the state in the post-war economy. In the Arab world, in the Arab region, we have a problematic issue, which is basically a series of conflicts and wars, mainly identified using identities. There were some studies about the economy of war in the Arab case, but this still needs a lot of efforts and contributions. So we networked with several initiatives seeking to achieve the same objective, participating in workshops in Northwestern University in Qatar and contributing in the work group based on the initiative of security in context, and also economies of war in the 21st century during the annual conference. And this actually initiative comes in this context in order to fill the data gap or the information or knowledge gap in this field. So I would like to move now to my dear colleagues. I will first start by asking generic questions, and then we move to specific questions. I'll switch to English now. في البداية سؤال للجميع.
On the central idea of our event, the concept of war economy. How would you define war economy in relation to different contexts? Should the study of war economy be limited to war duration, or should also include economic activities during times of peace?
Thank you very much, Tariq, for these invitations and for organizing these events. I will start with very general comments on war economy because I'm not a specialist on economy itself, but when I embarked on doing my research on war economy, I kind of faced I had more of a criticism towards the host of scholarships that devised lots of theories about how to approach political economies during times of conflicts and in a pre-war context. Now, because I was applying it on Syria, which kind of even adds more volumes and add more multi-layers and multifaceteds and complexities to how we can approach political economy and understand it within the context of the Syrian war. I found that there were three distinct aspects or interrelated aspects that can be more of that help scholars to understand how to evaluate the role of political economy or the effects of political economy on certain contexts, especially during civil wars. Is first, most of these scholars have studied political economies in terms of to what extent they instigate violence or the outbreak of violence in certain contexts. So they more of studied the drivers of violence behavior in terms of the material benefits theories, grievance theories, and they started to illuminate the relationship between drivers of violent behavior and the role of economy or the material benefits. The second one is the longevity of these wars, especially new civil wars as Barbara Walters defined it. To what extent political economy, for example, the scholars started to ask these questions, to what extent political economy or war economy impact the longevity of certain wars. The third one is its impact on peace process. Now, when we, in terms of unpacking these three aspects, that the longevity, the behavior or the fighter's behavior, or to what extent these material benefits impact tactical choices for these fighters to continue with fightings, or in terms of peace process, these three interrelated concepts actually also fail in understanding the full pictures of the conflict itself. So in terms of the new civil wars that we are having, for example, the Syrian case, it's quite difficult to have a political economy approach to the Syrian context without unpacking the conflict itself as a regional conflict or as a proxy war. So in terms of the war economy, you have to study how regional actors, for example, are monopolizing certain cross lines, certain cross borders, in a way to sustain their power and to have these kind of regional, to sustain their regional or maintain their regional interests. Now, in terms of the second approach, which is the state monopolizations or manipulations of, for example, humanitarian aid or empowering certain political elites in certain businesses or liberalizing economy, as in the pre-war context in Syria, we found that it's not enough for us to understand the instigations of violence or the outbreak of violence only by emphasizing or by focusing on how the regime manipulated economy in Syria in pre-war conflicts. At the same time, the third aspects and the related aspects is the rise of the non-state actors in Syria, where militias, in order to have legitimacy and representation, they started to use illicit economy. And this illicit economy was, this was my focus in this paper, was on the use of drugs, the use of captagon, and how such use of illicit economies that also, while it's prolonged the conflict in a way, but also sustained the power and authority of these non-state actors. Now, by bringing different examples, or historical example, or from historical context, we found that while, for example, in Colombia and in Northern Ireland, most of the peace deals failed at in certain periods because of the lack of having a more of social socio-political approach to these conflicts. So they did not integrate communities into the dialogue of how to end these illicit economies, because you have non-state actors with authorities, with like sustaining authority over the populations by using these illicit economies for a long period of time, but at the same time, you have this kind of patrimonial relationship between these non-state actors and the population itself. So without integrating more of a socio-political approach, integrating these kind of people from the ground to empower them in a way to stop this kind of illicit economies, more of this top-down approach on these militias fail. Now, I want to move to the second concept of the characteristics of war economy. Now, also, like it has been defined that there are 5 characteristics of war economy. First, it starts with the destruction of the formal economy, with increasingly blurred distinction between formal, informal, and criminal activities. The second one is the widespread predatory behavior by armed combatants. The third one is the highly decentralized and privatized economies. Now, the fourth one is more focus, and there has been much focus on the armed groups or the militias and how they use illicit economies in the latest years, and how they exploit illicit trading networks. Now, when I kind of applied these 4 or 5 characteristics on the Syrian context, I found that the geography, you cannot understand political economy without understanding the geography of Syria, or the geopolitical context where the borders and the sovereignty of the state, at the same time how, for example, Turkey is trying to manipulate its cross-border, Bab al-Hawa, and the access of the humanitarian aid, and at the same time how the Syrian regime also trying to manipulate these cross lines and cross borders. Now, the third one, and this is related, Tariq, to your questions, how does war economy impact peace process? Actually, I asked 4 questions in my research, which is that especially for more of focus on the militia instrumentalizations of, for example, drugs during civil wars. Now, I asked 3 questions. How does access to illicit economies affect the strengths of belligerent groups? And this is quite related to HTS, SDF, because there is quite evidence, and from my research, that HTS, while on the front, or they try to say that we are fighting Captacon, like we're in controlled regime areas. Also, the regime are more of using this propaganda, but they are also accomplice with these illicit economies. And this is very much related to cross-border and cross-lines. Now, the second question is what conditions influence the size and scope of the benefits that belligerent groups derive from their interactions with illicit economies. So illicit economies here, as I said, they provide legitimacy and representations for the non-state actors. And breaking these illicit economies sometimes will impact the population. And this is from the interviews that I had in Idlib and in northern Syria, where the illicit economies, we are not only talking about the warlords, but more of another layers from the population that they are also accomplished with this illicit economy. So, and here comes the programs of DDR, demobilization, demilitarization, and reintegration, where they have to focus on that. Now, the third one is how do governments' policies, and here I'm using governments, but I mean the regime, how do regimes' policies towards the illicit economy affects the strengths of belligerents and ultimately limit and contain or exacerbate military conflict? Now, in Syria, we have a stalemate, more or less. But now, and I'm sorry to say that after the earthquake, we are going to have a new political scene in Syria, especially with the opening of the cross-border and cross lines among these. And I'm waiting for the next few months to see to what extent illicit economies will be further entrenched by the opening of these crossings, and how this will impact the future political scene in Syria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tariq, and also thank you for inviting me. I haven't been to Doha Institute for 5 years, and it's really, really lovely to be back. I think, so my sort of entrance into this field comes very much from the sort of bottom-up perspective, so working anthropologically, working more with the civilian side of civilian-military relations, and focusing on Egypt. I think in many ways, this question kind of triggered to me thinking about, you know, is it actually an engagement with a war economy? Because I'm looking at the way that the military in Egypt is part of the national market, and you know, in a lot of sectors now, very much controlling market actor. And I think for the Egyptian case, in many ways, then it's not necessarily a war economy. However, I do think, and talking about like legitimization and sort of these moral questions that our colleague earlier today was touching upon, even though, you know, I wouldn't necessarily define Egypt as a war economy, there still are, you know, the threat or the regime's use of a threat of uprisings, insurgency, low-scale conflict in Sinai, and also conflicts in the region that are used to legitimize the role that the military plays nationally and also obviously in the economy, but more so the opaqueness of their role. So basically using not necessarily a threat of war, but a threat of or a fear of unrest and also economic unrest to legitimize, for example, legal reforms that have now made it almost impossible even to inquire into certain aspects of the market and military activities. It also made me think about, you know, your question more about should we delimit our inquiries to zones of war, ongoing sort of hot conflicts. And it made me think not of the Middle Eastern case, but in my home country of Norway, there are currently ongoing debates about the way that our state is benefiting from the conflict going on in Ukraine, selling weapons and ammunitions and earning money, but also in the secondary degree with the energy crisis in Europe, also, you know, filling Norwegian coffers because we sell gas. And there's been these moral debates about what responsibilities do we have as war profiteers, basically. And there has been not initiatives yet, but there are discussions of initiatives to push for creating a fund or even donating all of the surplus earnings that the Norwegian state holds from the energy crisis to Ukraine. Sort of to be concluded yet. This debate is still very quite hot. But basically, I think the moral question then forces, I would say, absolutely, to look beyond sort of zones of hot conflict or ongoing war, both regionally and then also, as I try to do in my research, also historically. Because the paper that I've been working on is very much an engagement with narratives, historical narratives of Egyptian military victories, so looking specifically at the 1973 war, and the way in which that very much is utilized to create an idea of this, you know, benevolent military protector, and that protector also playing a natural role in being a sort of engine in the driving of developing the Egyptian national economy. So yeah, I don't think I give you any definitions, but definitely interested in pulling on these delimitations.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Mandy Turner, she also has been working on war economy, and she has been criticizing this concept. In particular, she proposed the political economy of violence instead for economy as a way to expand all activities and practices that can be part of this war economy. She wants, for example, to include phenomena like revolutions, uprisings, other criminal activities and so on. And this is still subject to heated debate in this circle, right? And interestingly, Mandy Turner, Mary Kaldor, if you know about her, the one who influenced the field by proposing new wars debates during the 1990s. other ladies who have been influencing the field of war economies. And as such, there is no surprise that the panel is filled with ladies as well today. So please.
Yeah, so I think I won't disagree with the trend. In fact, I think if I was to answer the question directly, it would look at to what extent is as a war economy, to what extent is a local or national economy intimately tied to war making? And of course, this isn't the same across different countries, regions of the world, right? It has a particular narrative. And obviously now in our contemporary moment, very much tied to US imperialism, right? So obviously the US economy is intimately tied to war making in a very specific way. And actually it's been able to outsource most of its wars so that they don't take place on domestic soil. But of course they continue to profit. So as was said in the introduction, my area of research is Palestine, the ongoing colonization of Palestine. And of course, that gives us a very specific dynamic as well about to what extent does war or in fact violence shape the economy there. And I think to maybe add something to kind of what was said, I think if we look at police as a different sort of front of war making, that actually gives us quite an important understanding of a sort of continuation of war once it comes perhaps more stable. And I think we were talking about this at lunch, like a lot of the funding going into Egypt right now is perhaps towards its police forces, but there isn't like a hot conflict necessarily going on. In Palestine, the Palestinian security forces spend one of the largest per capita of their, if you can call it a GDP, on arms, right, which is interesting considering they don't have control of their borders, they don't have control of 80% or arguably 100% of their territory, and yet receive huge amounts of funding to shape their armed forces from France, from the UK, from the US, from Canada, from Australia. And a lot of my research has been tracing these links between foreign actors trying to shape Palestinian security forces. Well, there's like a particular reason also why so much funding goes into that, right, to prevent precisely Palestinians from resisting against the settler colonial enclave of Israel, which is there. And then I think, do I have time?
Yeah, please
Yeah.
go on.
So, and then just so I think looking at the funding of like local police forces gives us like a really important sort of analysis of war making, right? Once it kind of gets out of that perhaps hot version. And if you look at the funding of the Tunisian police forces since its uprising, a very successful uprising, one would argue, is, again, by French and British forces. So if you just, return to Palestine for a moment, I think the settler colonial context gives us an understanding of the importance of the ongoing war against the indigenous population is both important materially and symbolically for the state of Israel. It gains... its economy is intimately tied to trying to destroy Palestinian resistance. And so I think maybe just a sort of final point on that and linking to Kevin's presentation today, I mean, I think also what kind of worries me about this, maybe like what Mandy's talking about and what, you were both saying, the political economy of violence. And it does really frighten me because it's like you see these arbitrary forms of violence, right? So what are the kind of economies that kind of circulate around that, creating certain forms of vulnerability? I mean, in South Africa, you saw the end of the apartheid, but then also a rise of criminal activity in South Africa since then. And yeah, if you were, of course, also in parts sort of like Mexico, Haiti, places that have been impacted by US imperialism, also have sort of extreme forms of arbitrary violence that you wouldn't say are in a war context, but, right, so I think I'll end it there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'll move to the second question now. I mean, would like to know more about your stance on the ongoing debate surrounding the principle of follow the money and cover the power dynamics. I mean, how do you align with the critical political economy approach that gives priority to the study of conflict dynamics, meaning like issues such as production, distribution of power and wealth, how different modes of accumulation, class and social relations, political alliance are established, as opposed to focusing on, identity issues, race, religion, and other identity-related loyalties. Yeah,
Okay.
please.
Yeah, well, again, because I usually, well, in my research, I focus on nationalism, identity, specifically more of how to having heterogeneous, for example, societies and how does that impact transition to democracy. But when I started with this kind of political economy, I started with the questions, why do fighters continue to fight? And that kind of brought me to political economy or war economies. Now, in terms of follow the money, that's more of, and kind of unpack the power dynamics in a certain context, that definitely kind of manifests in the Syrian context to a larger extent. So we have more of an interstate conflicts, competitions among most of regional actors to sustain their interest in Syria or even security, but at the same time we have intrastate conflicts where we have also fratricidals in fighting among militias. And this fratricidal in fighting among militias, there have been lots of theorizations around that it's because of radicalization, ideology, or can ideology predict violent behaviors for these militias, but now I think there is a shift after 2018 in understanding the Syrian conflict, where ideology does play a role, but not as much as economy and material benefits for most of these fighters. From the interviews that I've conducted in the previous year, I've asked most of these fighters when I did focus groups with them, it's not ideology as much as the material benefits and the need for the daily lives, for them to the economy of their daily lives, sustaining their daily lives. At the same time, here comes the regional context, where we have Turkey, Jordan, and the new kind of rehabilitations of the regime that also has in its implicitly has more of containing the illicit economies that the regime has been doing or practicing for the last few years. So the regional dynamics of war making is pretty much also aligned with the personal choices. I'm here also, when I used the two theories in my research, greed and grievance, I kind of also contextualize it with the rational choice theory for these fighters. So these fighters, I don't want to kind of construct an image of them as without an agency. So they do have an agency where that they chose to continue fighting for certain material benefits. And this also is very much linked to the longevity of the Syrian, or predicting the longevity of the Syrian war, if that answers your questions in a way. Thank you.
So again, the anthropologist, I feel like for me, the idea of follow the money is very much like from a need to operationalize a lot of things. And, I'm probably completely misquoting him, but the late Frederick Barth, who founded my department, basically said, when you can do nothing else count. Because, you're in any situation and trying to start to make sense of things. What are the things that you can actually, what are the tangibles, in a sense? Money are, I feel, no longer tangible, but so for me, it's very much about an operationalization. But I obviously do think that political economy and sort of economy is very much tied to these other aspects. So, I wouldn't, for me, it almost doesn't make sense to separate class from sort of identity. And also having done some research in the Gulf and looking at migration from Egypt to Qatar specifically, you have all of these old models to understand how migration and labor functions in the Gulf, which is very much based on ideas of ethnicity and hierarchicalization. Excuse my terrible pronunciation of ethnicity. But what I always sort of come to find is that underlying all of this is always this aspect of class. There's always this aspect of economy, and just as Dr. Rahaf was saying, like, you know, what are people's daily lives about? How do you sustain yourself? And, you know, that this is a question that can be asked from, you know, very much like a subsistence level all the way to, you know, expats and people who are also more, how do you say, more privileged economically. But you know, again, I'm coming very much at this from a bottom-up perspective and sort of a very micro focus. But I think my point would always be that the two are very much interlinked. I would always feel the need to sort of operationalize these questions and using economy as a way to do that.
Thank you. Catherine?
I left it on. Okay, so I think to try and answer the question about following the money, I guess it's, you know, what kind of money is being generated from what kind of industries and who is benefiting from it. And then I guess to link that point to the question of identity or social structures, you know, what kind of, and I don't mean to sound like essentializing here, but I'll expand on this in a moment. What kind of people are emboldened by the creation of certain illicit regimes or certain sort of practices? So I guess, like, if you think about a war economy, does it create certain hidden spaces, both, you know, away from public eye? Does it create, you know, certain clandestine spaces? And what kind of people are getting involved in trade in those areas? So just to mention my research more specifically, like I looked at areas in which are supposed to be sort of under Israeli. So if you look at, like, I was going to show you a map, but I don't know if I have time for that. But if you look at the West Bank, just the West Bank, so not historic Palestine for a moment, and you look at militarized areas, these are areas that are supposed to be under Israeli security control, and so the Palestinian civil police do not have, like, access to these areas. Those are areas in which you have seen an increase in crime over the last 10, 15 years, and these are also areas which are sought after, right, for expansion of Israeli settlements. They're places that are, like, next to the wall. So it's like areas that have been militarized, for example. I mean, I know all of it's militarized, but specifically do not have access to other forms of sort of surveillance by police. You see an increase in levels of crime there. And I guess to answer the second part, right? So it's like, well, so we have a growth in perhaps certain kinds of production because of an economy of war or a militarized economy. And I think, without trying to draw a specific line, a causal relationship, because I think this is sort of a more structural argument. But so you do see an increase in levels of criminalization in areas in East Jerusalem, for example. Again, they don't have, I mean, I could talk about this for ages, but they don't have, like, a police force, right? So it's monitored by different forms of, like, surveillance, a lot of them local. Anyways, the point being is also, with increased levels of crime, you also see it much harder for people to create networks to sort of resist. It fragments communities. It creates a lot of mistrust. It creates a lot of potential to find collaborators. So, like, I think that there's, you know, if you look at sort of what kind of industries are created during these moments of, or during a settler colonial practice, or and the kinds of industry that are created, it also sort of emboldens, I think, certain people at certain times, and has the potential to fragment communities also.
Okay, thank you for this interesting. You have mentioned already some insights from your research. This was my actual specific question, just to give us an idea about your research.
Well, as I said before, I started this research with more of an identity-based focus, like why do civil wars last, or how long do they last, and is ethnicity, sectarianism, or the sectarian dynamics play a role in maintaining or prolonging these conflicts? And then I started with the greed and grievance theories, which are the most classical ones when applied on civil wars, especially since the 1991. And I found like I have more of a, I hope that like you will see from my tomorrow's presentation, that I had more of a critical intervention into these theories, that you cannot devise these two theories into understanding why the civil war in Syria happened, or the outbreak of violence continue since the 2012, when the militarization of the conflict like that started. Now I use these two theories and I applied them more of the I'm calling it the pre-war economy in Syria, because I don't think that there was not a war economy in Syria, because it was very privatized and it was very much centralized in the way. And then when Bashar al-Assad came, he kind of seemingly liberalize it, but at the same time, it more of sustained and consolidated his power. So I would term it as the war economy in pre-2011. Now, after 2011 and the outbreak, there was more, I focused on the horizontal and vertical inequalities, and more of, also took the more of the identity-based approach to understanding the outbreak of violence of civil wars. But at the same time, using the greed theory more of after the militarization of the conflicts on the militia groups, and especially, and unfortunately as Syrian, I'm saying that it's kind of manifests itself very much in the Syrian context, because we have fratricidal infighting among militias, which means that the greed theory is there after the militarization of the conflict, and especially among different, even similar ideological groups, where there were fightings among them, even though that they have similar ideological views. Now, the grievance theory was more used in my research on the uprising, where I more of analyzed how that there were grievances and there were more of sectorization, especially in terms of the narrative by the regime, that there was sectorizations of national identity on one aspect, or even enforcing a pantheist identity on most of the populations, which created more of a mythical architectures of national belonging and identity, that who is loyal, who is not loyal, and how of the in-group and out-group. So the grievance theory was used in the pre-war, and the greed more of after-war and on militia groups. And then the third part of my research was more of asking questions to fighters. Why do you continue fighting? The role of the symbolic world of their, the symbolic aspects of their world. What songs do they listen to? Is it Islamic songs? Is it radical songs? What kind does ideology play part in maintaining this violence going on, or why do they join fighting, or when did they stop fighting? So it took two groups between the ex-fighters and also those fighters who are continuing to they are still in these militias. So yeah, so I try to have more of a critical approach of these three theories, and not to say that this theory kind of give us a holistic picture of why we have like a long-term or a decade of war in Syria. So yeah, I devised these three kind of theoretical framing on different timelines.
Thank you, Rahaf. Mary?
Thank you. So my research that I'm presenting tomorrow is actually based on work that I started almost 10 years ago, where I was doing fieldwork in Egypt in 2013, I was looking at marriage and masculinity, but then returning to Egypt after Morsi had been deposed and the Sisi regime took over. I went back to explore civilian-military relations. What really sort of caught my interest and that I'm now revisiting was there's a museum in Cairo that's dedicated to the 6th of October war. And it's quite an interesting type of museum. It's an interactive museum. And then speaking to my contacts and my interlocutors, and also visiting the museum myself, this is a museum that's very much visited by school kids. It's very common to go on a tour with your teacher for kids in the Cairo area. And this museum then is focused on the 73 war, obviously. And then what I'm trying to do in the paper is exploring how this paired with this military business complex, very much based on Zainab Abdelmag's work. I'm trying to sort of take her analysis a little bit further. So she analyzes the Egyptian military as a hegemonic force, looking very much at how through the permeation of the national market, not only is the military, but also employer, educator, but also, manufacturer, distributor, provider of, from basic things like food goods all the way to internet connection, phone companies, energy companies, et cetera. And then I'm trying to take it sort of a step further to look into sort of the cognitive, not restructuring, but sort of this work that's being done through very specific activation of symbols around the military, as I mentioned, as this sort of benevolent protector of the nation, and sort of the gloriousness of the Egyptian army, and the way in which it's also very much tied to the presidency. If you go visit the museum, I'm hoping some of you have been there, it very much traces the civilizational history of Egyptian militaries all the way back to pharaonic times. And then also visiting it in 2014, it became very striking that also Mubarak's image had not been removed, which pretty much all over the rest of town, statues or plaques or pictures of him and his family had been removed, but in this museum, he was still very much part of the narrative. And so through sort of engaging with these narratives, I'm analyzing the military in Egypt as a structuring structure. So sort of going beyond that hegemonic aspect and literally looking at how the military is not only shaping market opportunities and what you can buy and what's available and what you want, but also sort of the horizon of imaginations, and doing this very much through sort of collective remembrance of this glorious victory of 6 October. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think that my research is sort of directed by two key questions. One of them I've covered more specifically, and the other one I'm just starting to look at. So I guess the first question is, how are places policed in different ways, and how does this impact on local practices of violence and security more broadly? And I think the Palestinian case is so stark, because if I was to show you that map, you can look at all these different enclaves that we know are policed in very different ways. But in fact, I think that this happens everywhere, but just it's not so obvious, right? So I think that this understanding, or this argument that the state is comprised of a monopoly over legitimate use of violence is a myth, right? It doesn't actually exist in that way ever. And in fact, a lot of critical writing on policing now makes that very obvious, that policing is always discretionary. Think about even this country, right? We know people are policed in different ways. We know areas are policed in different ways. And right, so how does that impact on the levels of security and violence more broadly, right? So that's the kind of the big argument that I'm looking at. And then if you sort of narrow that in a place like the occupied or the colonized Palestinian territories, through my so this is research that I was doing over the last, let's say, four 4 years, and doing sort of interviews with the Palestinian civil police and just asking them quite a simple question, you know, how does the occupation or presence of the military impact on your access to certain areas, and what are the implications of this? And, you know, they talk about the growth of drug cultivations in H2 around Hebron, which, if you know, that's an area that is under specific military control. It's also an area that settlers are particularly interested in because of its religious importance. And so that area becomes sort of unpoliced. You have an increase in drug cultivation there, and it puts people in a particular precarious position vis-a-vis the settler. So you have these sort of what I call sort of criminalized supply chains, depending on how areas are policed in different ways. And you can create particular corridors of the movement of illicit goods. So of course, borders are a really important example of that, right? Like, we know things move through borders, right? They're not this sort of secured area. But in fact, police decide what moves and what doesn't move, right? They know very well what moves through borders, right? So if you look at this zone, Seam region, if you're familiar, which is, you have a lot of Israeli factories that are in Israel on the other side of the same region. It's an area of like growth, and you have a lot of, the numbers are not clear, right? But you have children who are trafficked, right, into Israel to work in these factories. You have a lot of sort of a migrant labor, migrant labor is a rich term, but right, people moving and to work in these factories, and the police know, right? So it's kind of looking at that dynamic, right? How do they allow certain, and what are the implications for the local population, which I'll very, very briefly mention that, because it's the new research, which is, you know, how are therefore local populations trying to provide protection for themselves when the police pose a threat to their communities, right? So looking at how communities specifically are trying to develop local forms of protection without police, and specifically in a context where you have the police that are threatening your well-being, like if you are a Palestinian living in historic Palestine under Israeli colonization. So you know, I think this comes of, you know, like talking to people who are trying to think about ways to protect themselves when the police actually pose a dramatic threat to life. And yeah, so I'll leave it there. I think I won't.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting. I like just to clarify something in this context. Policing, yes, as a practice, but in Palestine, especially in the occupied territories, is not being practiced by police. I mean, police in a conventional sense, civil police or so on. About the army itself that practices a sort of policing, and also military police. But, you know, police that we see in the streets, certain streets, only for traffic, but also more, you know, to serve Israeli settlements, but not to police the Palestinian population. They are more into, you know, military and military police practices and policies. Yeah, so I have actually so many questions, but I will stop here. Give the floor to our colleagues, students, to interact with the panel. So the floor is yours. نفتح المجال للأسئلة والأجوبة للتعليقات ومشاركات. ممكن تفضل محمد.
Hi, my name is Salim. I'm a second year conflict management student. My question is, how much can we trust the literature provided on the war economy? How much can we trust the theoretical foundations and philosophical foundations that are built? I mean, whose economy are we using as a standard to analyze the war economy? Whose policy are we serving when we use the term war economy? How is it really being utilized by foreign powers when we, as academics or critical academics, use the term war economy and then it's used by someone else's foreign policy? Especially, as you said, with the Ukraine war, with the Syrian war, there's constant use of, especially in state fragility, where it's constantly used to legitimize foreign intervention. And my other question is, shouldn't we be talking about the neoliberal paradigm as well? I was reading critical literature on it, and it was basically saying that we have no longer class relationships in society. Society is built on a person or the self-exploiting itself. So is it correct to use the class terminology to analyze the problem? Thanks.
Thank you. أسئلة أخرى؟ تفضل دكتور عمار.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I found your discussions of a lot of the underlying concepts very fascinating, and your research I have already read and know it's I came in knowing it's fascinating. One of the things that kind of came to mind while the discussion was taking place around follow the money and what the money actually means. And Dr. Norbakk brought up something that was interesting to me, is thinking of money as just really a way to operationalize something. And so my question is ultimately, what is that thing that we can operationalize through that money? What is it that money can be used as a proxy for in terms of understanding sort of latent power structures, and what can't it be used for? So relatively simple question, I think, but yeah.
Okay, Mr. Rahaf.
I will start with the. Yeah, okay. I will start with the first questions about how war economy is introduced, or can we trust the definitions in Western? Is that, I mean, I'm just okay. Can we trust how war economy is defined in Western academia or in scholarships? Well, it's quite well. When I started, I said it many times in this panel, that when I started, I embarked on this research with more of critical, that I wanted to do critical intervention to greed and grievance theory, or how political economy is understood. Most of the theories that, most of the scholars that I read on, when they were using political economy as an approach, they used statistics and quantitative approach, which I have a problem, because that kind of reduces us into numerics. And I think, or also fail to unpack the more of the complex social political situations in each kind of case study. And I find it really difficult when we put a table of civil wars where it's ended and why, and how many, in whether, and if this was related to the heterogeneity of that society or not, which again reduces us into sects, numbers, ethnicities, and kind of devoid us of our agency as people, or even like the relationship between this kind of the state-religion relationship, also defined it more of a intervening into the personal choices of these citizens. In a way, we're not like, do we read these scholarships? Yes, and where I think our role as academics is kind of to not decolonize. Also, like, I have to be skeptical of using decolonizing knowledge production, but at the same time, more of maybe contextualizing, or not even contextualizing, is more of saying at the beginning that these theories have its own limitations, and have its own also at the same time specificities or certain approaches. So when we use war economy, that's the first dilemma that I kind of found when I started this research, that do I mean it's the state, how the state is using war economy after the war, or no? I should use it before the war, because for me, there was war economy even before 2011, before like the kind of official media, or like that they said like, look, you have war in Syria. So it's our role to use these kind of theorizations, these framings, and kind of decontext it, and more of use it in a way that critiquing it, but at the same time using it to have it more, to be more specific in our case studies. That's more of what I try to do. Thank you.
I will not go into that aspect, but move on. I think the point that was being made about sort of the neoliberal paradigm and sort of this question of whether or not the class concept is obsolete, I don't think it is. I think that I feel that a lot of sort of, I don't even know what to term it, like economic or ideological, like at some point it's so entangled, but these changes that we see that, you know, some of us term neoliberal changes, I think if you look at it sort of when it happens within economies, I think some of those moves are undermining, you know, we can talk about whether they exist or not, but like these collective structures that some people would call identities or class. And because they are being stripped of their meaning or they're being undermined, or we sort of say that, okay, you know, people don't make decisions based on class status anymore. We don't see these patterns of generational sort of reproduction of social status, et cetera, that these things are obsolete. But I don't think that that is the case. But I do think we need to think about, you know, what does the concept of class mean today, because I think the bases for what I would still term class differences are maybe different. So, you know, just looking at my home society, people would say things like Norway is a classless society and things like that, but I think that's actually just a way to undermine class struggle, because if you tell people class doesn't exist, then why should you, you know, mobilize on the basis of it? But I do think what creates social classes today looks different. But this might also be my disciplinary bias. Then the question of what can we use money as a proxy for? A lot of times I've used it as a proxy for relationships, like literally, like trying to find something to hold on to say I can establish that there is a relationship between this entity and that entity, and where I literally use it at like individual levels. But I do feel like what can we not use them as proxies for is maybe the more interesting question. And, you know, I have colleagues who are very much against sort of political economy approaches in anthropology, or like, oh, you need to, you know, detangle yourself from these materialistic approaches. But I think that really doesn't make sense, because especially looking at sort of a world economy where things increasingly become commodified, I feel like, you know, the limit to which you can now use money as proxies to look into things is just expanding. And now I'm thinking of, you know, things like reproductive technologies and, you know, questions of, you know, surrogacy and, you know, should you be able to sell and purchase, you know, human substance, organs trade, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if there are things that we couldn't use it as proxies for. I need to think about that. But that is it's a really, really good question. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
So I think I'll look at the first two questions, because I don't. It's a really good question that you know, what can be operationalized. Yeah, it's interesting, because I wonder to what extent, like, the term war might be slightly depoliticizing in terms of an outbreak of a war, and perhaps doesn't direct our attention enough to the shape of a particular kind of war. And I don't I mean, I'm just offering that as an initial comment, but I think a lot, you know, it can be looked into further. But I think one of the questions Tariq asked us before was what literature inspires us. And I think a lot of the work that interests me is on counterinsurgency, right? So it is, you know, wars that are sort of waged for a very specific reason, right? Either to like quell or like, you know, crush dissident behavior, crush resistance, and what are the implications of that, right? And imperial powers on either side, right, European, Russian, can engage in counterinsurgency wars, right? So then I think the politics of that becomes much more clear. And that kind of, I think, relates to what I was saying before, that then you can also have, you know, so another text that I find really compelling is sort of ongoing counterinsurgency in Turkey, specifically in Istanbul, right? And the policing of particular communities that are, dissident communities, working class communities that are posing a threat to, or apparently posing a threat to the Turkish state in a particular way. And then, of course, the Kurdish community, right? And so then you have like war when there's no war, right? Then you do have like an ongoing war against your own population, even though it's not necessarily at war, right? And that's a kind of ongoing counterinsurgency that actually funds, a war economy of the Turkish state for decades, right? And just to offer a few comments on your second question about neoliberalism. I think perhaps the only thing I have to say to that in terms of my research is, so more recently, I've been doing work on, specifically in 48, so historic Palestine, and Palestinians that have over the last, there's been an increased rate in crime in Palestinian areas in Israel over the last decade, and so we did a lot of work with sort of community leaders, heads of popular committees, like why is this happening? And some of the answer is given is the impact of neoliberalization, right? And the increased sort of feeling of individuality amongst citizens, amongst men specifically, when you don't have access to sort of you don't have access to capital, right? You live in a settler colonial state where your access to like capital is limited, and you're moving into illicit regimes or illicit practices because that's the only way that you can gain access to capital. And so, I think you do see that, I think you mentioned this, right? Like the fragmenting of sort of community relationships and things like this. Also, global capital has done that with very specific intent, right? And there's a few really good books on that also that I can mention.
Thank you, Catherine. نحب نسمع أسئلة أكثر. تفضل.
Thank you. To how extent you agree with that the humanitarian international aids contribute in the war economy? Syria as a case, or let me say in another language, the prolongation factors, one of the prolongation factors for the protracted conflict in Syria, consider the international aids one of those prolongation factors. By the beginning of the Syrian conflict, Ludwig theory applied to the conflict by letting the conflict actors continue the war until they have been totally exhausted. All of us know that before the earthquake, the Syrian regime reached a critical point, and many governance sectors stopped to provide services. But now we say that we find that the international sanctions, the international sanctions now is suspended, and the humanitarian aids continued to the government-controlled area and other areas. So, to how extent you agree with this speech? Thank you.
We take more questions. Again, Muhammad.
Thanks for asking the question. I want to build on your proposal on bringing the term war. What's war? And I'm writing a section in my paper called Fiat Money and the Spirit of Neoliberalism. Before 1914, war had a different pattern than today, where two nations would meet up, fight, and once the money is over, everyone goes back home. But World War I and II set up a new pattern where nations can keep fighting until they exploit the entirety of capital in their nation. And that's why Germany failed. Because of hyperinflation, they exhausted their entire capital. And we're seeing a pattern until today where the war is on civilians, not on normal people. So can we say that fiat money has enabled a new pattern of warfare, a new pattern of war economy that allows the maximum exploitation of an economy? Can we link it to the monetary system? Or
What was the word? Fiat economy?
fiat money.
Oh,
Yes.
failed. What?
Yeah, so I have a question for Catherine. I really like this question you threw out, Tariq, about follow the money versus identity. And I guess I just wanted, actually, it's kind of gone in a different direction from what I understood from you, Catherine. You're saying maybe it's more about security versus money. And is one way to read your response that actually if you followed the money in your case, you wouldn't get very far, and that you need to look at variation in patterns of security to understand what's happening with money?
Thank you for that questions about the humanitarian aid. Do you want me to answer in Arabic? Because, okay. So, يعني as for like now, it's more, there has been lots of يعني policy reports about how Assad have manipulated the humanitarian aid, especially like, and also use economic sanctions as a propaganda. And I mean, and I have my own opinion about this, which might not be, yeah, I mean, in part, it's more of or has been more built on previous historical cases where economic sanctions were used or imposed on certain countries that did not change the behavior of those regimes. So, and they did have impact on the livelihood of everyday livelihood of citizens. Now, in terms of, I mean, it's not kind of, I have like, we all know as Syrians, I think you are Syrians, so it's kind of, there is a straightforward answer to that yes, all militias and not only the regime, they are manipulating and monopolizing, weaponizing humanitarian aid for their own benefits. So it's not only the regime, but other militias. And it's kind of also become very manifested in after the earthquake, where militias also denied access of or entry of humanitarian aid to northeast West Syria when it's coming from SDF areas or the regime's area. Now, so there is no kind of debate around is weaponizing, does humanitarian aid prolong the conflict? To some extent, yes, because that is reflected in the regional, is more of how the regional powers or the international community dealt with the Syrian crisis at the beginning, that they don't want to end the conflict, but more of manage the conflict, like إدارة الأزمة, not the resolution of the conflict or conflict resolution. And this is quite like also, as I said, it's reflected in the way that they manage humanitarian aid, the access, the cross lines. And as I mentioned in my first, at the beginning, where like there are 4 characteristics of war economies. That part of it is the more of trying to dominate the cross lines and the cross borders. And you've got to ask the questions why it's only the cross borders, the Bab al-Hawa is accepted, and why does that has to go through the Security Council? At the same time, also, and that's why the war economy is kind of also aligned with the questions of the regional dynamics that kind of also has an impact on solving this crisis or the conflict resolution. So yes, I do agree that there is a weaponization, manipulations of these humanitarian aid, and there is quite many reports, investigations going on how the regime used and manipulated this humanitarian aid and actually يعني النظام سرق من هي المساعدات to ease the economic sanctions on him, on the regime. Did I answer your questions or did you have? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, can I continue إجابة على سؤالك. يعني قضية
Your question when it comes to humanitarian assistance in the context of war, it becomes automatically part of the war economy, not only in Syria, but it extends beyond Syria to everywhere where there's conflict. So sometimes the organizations pay bribes in order for them to be able to get access to the armed militias or to any other group affiliated with a certain political regime. Also, the humanitarian organizations sometimes employ armed men for protection, and sometimes they lose from their storage facilities as a result of theft some of the goods. Sometimes you see the goods, food for instance, being resold. Why? Because they are actually controlled and exchanged with weapons from abroad. So there are several means and methods where the humanitarian assistance becomes part of the war economy. And this actually, microphone please. شكرا على تسليط الضوء على هذه النقطة. نود أن نعود إلى فكرة شرعية الميليشيات. So by using these assistance, this is kind.
Forced through the access of humanitarian aid through this cross line. يعني هنا لما بيستولوا على المعابر في طريقة.
So when they control the crossing points, هناك طريقة مرتبطة بالشرعية لهم الخاصة بهذا الموضوع. شكرا. سوف أترك الأسئلة لزميلتي. بالنسبة إلى النقد أنا لن أتدخل بالنسبة إلى هذا السؤال.
So I hope that like the answer doesn't feel too abstract. So I'll try to give like certain examples of it and maybe kind of actually deal with the three questions together because I think they're actually quite linked. So I guess what I took from the question is like, is there this sort of like shift in how war making is taking place, and that when you run out of money, you have to stop? Sure, yeah.
Because the money is being printed by the government.
Okay.
Stop when you exhaust the entire capital of the country.
Okay.
Not only the money with the government.
Okay. So I can't speak to like the specific sort of the sort of printed money by the German state, like at World War II at the end of the war. But I think like a lot of those structures, in fact, haven't changed, right? So although like technically like Germany lost the war, like most of the industries that benefited from the war stayed in the same hands and stayed actually profiting after the end of that war. And so I think, and that kind of links to this question. I mean, I just kind of want to just put a provocation out there that like, humanitarian assistance is sort of the reconstruction of places after they've been destroyed by war. And that is also a political project, right? It was for the US empire rebuilding Europe, after the Second World War. It was sort of, rebuilding Japan as well, like trying to expand sort of the reach of US capital. So it is politicized, right? And the same thing in Palestine, right? Like humanitarian aid is politicized. In trying to sort of favor certain projects over others. So I don't know if I have a really good answer to the question, but I guess, and again, it kind of feels a bit perhaps abstract, but so I think it's sort of like the people sort of benefiting, I think, from war sort of stay. It remains. It just shifts locations, shift types, etc. And I guess to answer the question, like when I saw this, follow the money question, my sort of gut answer to that was like actually like follow the weapons, right? Like money seems to be actually like less tangible than weapons, and actually like so I'm just trying to like unpack that. So I think actually like one of the concepts I work with a lot now are like structures of race and racism and white supremacy, right? And what didn't change after World War II was a sort of white supremacist control by, European and American capital. And I think like if you look at like this, the concept of racism, it's sort of like how do you sort of create different divisions between communities in order to extract more from one over the other, right? How do you divide the working class? Well, often I think this is like through the question of race. And so like, I mean, if I had more time to prepare, I could have prepared like an answer to that with examples. But so if you look at like coming back to the case that I'm more familiar with, which is Palestine, sort of you have certain areas where you see sort of growth of the economy, like the Ramallah bubble and things like this. But if you kind of follow where like the violence is taking place, it's, you know, where also you see kind of people dissenting, right, trying to resist against that. And yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. I think there was something we talked this morning about sort of seeing new divisions emerge and trying to pit, you know, different sort of groups against each other. And I think, you know, specifically trying to quell certain groups.
Shukran. I got the question actually with regard to fiat currency, but you should have added also blockchain technology. This is what I think. It's like centralization versus decentralization of finance. You know, you're talking about follow the weapons, but you know, money buys the weapons at the end. And here comes, you know, the idea of privatized wars, for example, following the 1990s, globalization. The idea of decentralized wars. And as such, for many forces, militias, they require necessarily decentralized tools and instruments to, for example, smuggle money or bring money. It's not dollar fiat currency as such. You can use other methods such as maybe, as some reports suggest, cryptocurrencies. Like how Bitcoin being exploited in certain contexts. Recently in Ukraine, I have read reports how militias try to transfer, you know, assets and wealth through using blockchain technology, because using gold, using dollars, especially through illegal or illicit ways, can be heavily controlled by central banks, by banks, and by governments. And as such, you resort into different methods. تفضلي هنا.
شكرا دكتور طارق.
Thank you, Dr. Tariq, and thank you for this panel discussion. I really did enjoy it. My question to Catherine, you were talking about the policing concept. It's actually a question and also not necessary to be answered now, but to motivate further discussion later on. I would like to understand how we can actually start to understand policing. Walter Benjamin has some attempts to differentiate between preserving law, and Mahmoud Bandani has several discussions, so preserving the law and talking about the criminal situation. So the response comes through the judiciary or the justice in order to respond to crime. The lawmaking concept, so a new lawmaking concept that is fundamentally linked with the political situation and to create a new political situation. So how can we understand the role of the police? Is it lawmaking or law preservance? Taking into account that the law preservance as a concept is based on a liberal model that says that law-making era has come to an end after Cold War. So how can we understand the role of the police, the violence of the police, and also the counter-violence to the violence of the police? Thank you. سؤال أخير. Thank you so much. ليس لدي سؤال بل لدي بضعة.
I come as a practitioner mostly who has worked in conflict areas for many years. And that meant that I came across and I lived in war economies in different settings throughout all of these years until very recently, until December. Dr. Aldoughli, thank you very much. At the beginning of your input or presentation, you pointed out to 3 areas where scholars have really stressed certain questions related to war economy, the impact on the peace process, the impact on the length of the war, as well as a driver of conflict or violence. I think one thing that is missing here is the impact on post-war economy. And this is very, very important. Speaking about this, I'm glad that you mentioned the impact of pre-war economy on the war economy. This is something that I've seen in different places. But also, we need to take stock, I think, always of the impact of the war economy on the post-war political economy. I've seen this, for example, in places like in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So there are interests that developed during the war, and these are carried over after the war. I mean, if you look at the case of Kosovo, for example, there was this relationship between the Albanian mafia, so to speak, and the Kosovo Liberation Army. And now, after the war, you have kinds of similar interests that were transferred from the war period until after that. The other question that I think was a little bit missing here is the kind of synergies that emerge during wars between the political economy of war, organized crime, and political violence. And by political violence, I don't only mean violence perpetrated by non-state armed actors. We're talking about insurgents as well as counter-insurgents at the same time, states in many ways. And to give you just a couple of examples from my experience in Iraq about these kinds of synergies. At the beginning of the insurgency, the United States, as part of its counterinsurgency efforts, they tried to win over some tribal chiefs in certain areas, mainly in Al-Anbar, in Salah ad-Din, and in Mosul. So they kind of directed contracts to them. And those tribal chiefs siphoned off at least part of the money to the insurgency. So in practice, the United States was partly financing at least some of the insurgent activities in Anbar or in some other places. And then the whole question of need that was also brought by Dr. Aldoughli. I think this is very important. It has nothing to do with ideology. We have seen it, at different sides of the political or ideological spectrum. The case of the FARC in Colombia and their involvement, or the Sendero Luminoso in the Peru. These are Marxist groups. In principle, they are opposed to drug trafficking, but then they needed to fund their insurgent activities. So they had to somehow establish relationships with drug traffickers. The same thing in Afghanistan. I worked in Afghanistan between 2014 and 2017. When the Taliban first came to power, they eradicated the poppy agriculture, nearly eradicated the production of drugs, nearly. But by 2014 to 2017, I used to go on trips in the field, and the country was full. We're talking about areas where the government and the coalition did not have much control. And when you talk to the locals, community leaders or farmers and all, he said, yeah, the Taliban allowed us to do it. And what did the Taliban gain? Well, they had to pay the agricultural tax, the ushur, the 1/10 at the time. So, I think there are many questions here. I don't have really a question, but I think these are areas for research. And these are things that I came across over many years. And the interesting thing is that you see commonalities in different places. Thank you very much. But it was really fascinating to hear all of you today. Thank you.
يعطيكم العافية. I will have just a comment. I prefer to say it in Arabic.
In reality, the economy of war in Syria, particularly, maybe is different than the other contexts. Kevin added something today in the morning during the Arab Center lecture. The pre-war and in the pre-war era, the Syrian regime actually had liberalization of the Syrian economy, but it was based actually on nepotism, because this privatizing of the economy had corruption but contributed at the same time to the prosperity of the economy in Aleppo, for instance. The same applies to the war. The war contributed to the prosperity of the economy at least until 2018. After 2018, we started seeing economic crises in areas controlled by the Syrian regime. For instance, the lira after 2018, with no conflicts or battles, we're talking about the pound, or $1 is 7,000 lira, or Syrian pound. When it comes to the war economy, there's another point at the theoretical level. In Syria, the war economy is contributing in supporting authoritarian resilience, the authoritarian regime resilience. How did this happen? Dr. Tariq and I have a study that is currently discussing this. How does war economy contribute to the resilience of authoritarian regimes? So there was a collapse of the army at the beginning, but the war economy allowed the regime to fund militias through this war economy, and then the economy changed the economic elite in Syria to an elite quasi-totally controlled by the Syrian regime. And through the drug trafficking, which is one of the activities of the war economy, the regime could fund its bureaucracy and keep some of its power projection when it comes to citizens. So I think that war economies played a very important role in Syria particularly. Thank you. Thank you so much. We will finish.
For your input. Yeah, actually, yeah, I did come across, I think I did not mention it here, but I did come across some of how post-war economies actually make peace deals are more fragile or susceptible to fail. Because of previous, during the war, like certain war economies or certain patrimonial relationships between the elites and the populations, and using illicit economies kind of exacerbate certain networks. And these networks after the peace deals sometimes fail. And also, actually, the one thing that really interested me in this, and I think I'm not sure if it's kind of, it's common, and while doing this research, I've more read on different contexts more than on Syria itself, because like to see to what extent that there are these commonalities is the role of mid-ranks officials or the mid-ranks militaries, not the warlords, but the mid-ranks. And actually, to be honest, that these are the ones that maybe in post-war Syria, they would have the impact on sustaining either a peace deal or failing the peace deals. So they would have more of that kind of central position or central rule. Now, in terms, I don't know if I have more to add on that, but definitely yes. Following the post-war, or how the post-war economy would be like, its impact or its effect on On sustaining peace deals, yes, definitely. But unfortunately, because I don't see, as a Syrian, I don't see that the war will end very soon. So I did not carry on more or delve into that research very much because like you don't see that hope yet. We are not there yet. Now, in terms of Khalid's comments, yes, definitely I do agree with most of what said, that the liberalization of economy in, when Bashar al-Assad came, to some extent, it was more of, it's centralized power. In certain, and here we have to study the class and the sect because it does denounce the kind of normative narrative about like, look, the regime is sectarian. Yes, it's sectarian, it's violence approach, but at the same time they did use other, Sunnis, leadership in Sunni ulamas, for example, in the religious arena to, again, to make authoritarianism more fluid. I would say, يعني مرونة هي authoritarians, that they can be very, very fluid, that they are not even fixated on a certain approach to maintain their authoritarianism. So, yeah, I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.
شكرا. بس أنا إضافة لأنه هذا الموضوع أيضا بهم.
I would like to add something because this is something important to me. The war economy becomes part of the reconstruction, the rebuilding of the state and peace at later stage. The liberalist paradigm is one of... Please speak closer to the microphone, please. Could the gentleman speak closer to the microphone? So the network that are created in the pre-war economies become part of the new regime. This is why the same actors controlling the war economy remain the elite controlling the state institutions, and this is why you find corruption, volatile state institutions, organized crime. I think this will continue since the liberal paradigm that is implemented through the World Bank, the IMF, etc. This is the normal and natural result, in my opinion.
Last comments, that sounds so final. No, I just wanted to touch on the point that was being made about the needs basis, and I absolutely agree, and I think that is so to the point. And I think it also goes back to that question of, follow the money, and because there is something about not sort of overlaying people's intentions with terms or basically, adding to either what they tell you or what you see, but literally boiling it down to these needs bases, and then obviously that's also where sort of the importance of the context enters, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier as well, like sort of being able to zoom in and out, and combining. Sort of, this is also me putting in a case for the anthropologists, but combining the very much bottom up with top-down perspectives, and not aiming for a one perspective approach. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Yeah, I think more than one perspective approach is really good, and I think actually like one of the questions that fascinates me most is actually looking at the various histories of policing and how they work in different ways in different places. But there are some commonalities that are generally looked at in the literature, that if you look at the history of modern policing, so sort of in a sort of post-colonial period. So, one is, police developed as a sort of basically to prevent the working class from asking for better working conditions, right? And this was all across North Africa, with both sort of native policing as well as imperial policing. So if you have people organizing to ask for better working conditions, if you develop a sort of permanent police force, and that police force is often also comprised of working class people, right? So what is the easiest way to prevent working class from rising up? You give them weapons, right? And you give them a uniform, and they're your police, right? And they're, right, in in Palestine, there are people that are sort of pushing back against this, but this also happened, right? That you've developed a huge security force, and you've given them weapons and you've given them salary, right? And structurally, their purpose is very clear. And this is why, like, the biggest thing, you know, you see, like, security coordination is one of the biggest issues, right? It's like, structurally, the police serve a very specific purpose, right? Is to stop sort of dissidents from rising up. Another one that's popularly referred to in the literature is to gather intelligence, right? If you look at, like, post-colonial police forces, like, there's the development of a gendarmerie. And so part of my research is trying to trace, like, how did you enforce justice and order prior to the development of modern police forces? But, like, you know, so Stuart Schrader is another text that I look at a lot, and he makes this argument, right, that the police are really to gather intelligence. So all of a sudden, like, they're not worried about that higher level of violence and conflict we're used to. They start looking at things like permits and traffic violations and all these things, but they're actually able to sort of surveil population in a wide, you know, sort of wider scale practice. So I think that the sort of comparative understanding of policing is really interesting. And I think I really appreciate this comment that you made about being able to sort of draw upon, you know, drug economies in order to fund a resistance or fund an insurgent, or, and actually I think that would be really interesting research. I think you wouldn't want that to be made public in case, you know, people are still trying to use, you know, those sources of funds to sort of organize. But yeah, so I think that yeah, I don't want to carry on too long, but I think this is an interesting thing, how, you know, being able to use certain illicit economies in order to fund dissident action. And the last thing I'll say is that, right, the criminalization of that practice is also really important. So I think this comes back to your question about, like, operationalizing the money, right? And who has, like, the power to kind of, like, operationalize and define how certain forms of trade, right, are used. And if you're involved in illicit activity, you can also be arrested, right? So I think that, like, this question of, like, police it doesn't sort of uniformly, you know, I think, okay, so, all right, and I'll wrap up, but, like, my research on policing is actually looking at how they selectively sort of enforce certain practices in different areas at different times, right? So I think, like, who has the power to sort of identify how certain forms of trade are understood and conceptualized and things like this, right? And if you're involved in drug activity, you can be sort of criminalized, right? So it does make you vulnerable, I think, to that kind of label if you're involved in that kind of trade.
Okay. Thank you very much. شكرا جميعا على
for being with us, and good evening to you all.